I have a previous talk titled The Number One Problem is False Morality by False Gods. And what I find over and over in various different areas of society and my own personal life and the personal lives of others is that the main problem really is a false morality. Namely, thinking something is good that's actually bad, and thinking something that is actually bad is good. So, concerning something of extreme importance, namely the best way to undo poverty in the world and undo exploitation and oppression and environmental destruction, pretty much the one thing that would help the most, which is recognizing that we should all see homesteading land, water, and seed as a birthright. The reason why that solves so many of these problems, just to briefly go through them, is, for example, with poverty, well, the number one expense for people on the planet is paying rent, right? Paying a mortgage, paying for a place just to sleep at night, right? So if it's a sovereign homestead, that's your birthright. That means it's cost and tax free. So you don't have the number one expense in the world. Obviously, that would greatly reduce poverty and help people be more self-sufficient and healthy and prosperous. Concerning the environment, people were living more naturally like that and not dependent on corporations, which tend to pollute quite a lot because of their mass production, for example, being one major factor. Because it's cheaper to do the more toxic way, usually. GMOs being a big example. Also, for profit, which would not be an issue if everyone was growing their own food, right? If you had just your own organic garden and orchard, and so did others in your community. Maybe there would be a small organic farm that people worked at in the community that, then provided even more food. But you wouldn't have the environmental damage that exists now, right? People are living naturally and more self-sufficiently. You wouldn't have dependence either on petroleum, right? And oil companies, of course, have done a lot of damage just across the board, deforestation, giant livestock farms causing immense water pollution, right? Just on and on, all these industries that people are working for because they have to earn a paycheck because they don't have a free place to live on the planet, right? It would greatly reduce environmental damage, without a doubt. And additionally, people are usually smart enough not to poison their own well, right? You're not going to cover your own homestead in toxins. Well, hopefully you wouldn't. It'd be less common. And it wouldn't be necessary because on the small scale, you don't need, for example, like insecticides and herbicides. It's much more manageable and it's much less of an issue when it's a diversity of plants in a small space, right? You can take care of it manually and with non-toxic means. So, no need for crop dusters, flying over giant fields, spraying toxins on GMO crops, right? All of that would be totally unnecessary. Would not even be something that would develop like it has in society. And then all the issues with just various workplaces that can actually be very harmful to workers and at the least very, dissatisfying, and that cause also, for example, parents needing to leave the home, right, to earn the money at some job, and so then their children, it seems, have to go to the state school. And state schools, of course, especially lately, are extremely problematic in what they're teaching and what they're doing with children. So that wouldn't be an issue either, because you could homeschool much more easily. So yeah, if everyone had, say, a couple acres of land for free, no property tax, no cost, if that was just recognized as a birthright, it definitely would solve a lot of problems. I don't think anyone would argue against that. It's pretty clear that, as I've just briefly explained, it would help people quite a lot if, just if they didn't have to pay rent or a mortgage alone, right? Just or property tax, right? If that was just not in the equation, people would be doing a lot better, right? People would just have space too, right? A lot of people are in places that are abusive or at the least very uncomfortable. But if they had a couple acres of land that could be their own, right? What a relief that would be on a personal level, emotional level as well, to just have some distance from people that you don't want to be next to, right? Have some autonomy, have some privacy, have some freedom. They say, I've heard that actually the number one factor for happiness is a sense of autonomy. Well, if you have your own autonomous space, that would certainly go a long way towards supporting personal autonomy and therefore happiness, right? Logic train, I think I just went on. Okay, so I was thinking about this issue of false morality being the number one problem again because of the objections that I have heard, that I pretty much always hear when I bring up this idea of sovereign homesteads. And I may present it through the illustration of imagining you're on a boat with a bunch of other people, like just tourists, whatever. And something happens and the boat gets lost somehow and loses communication and but ends up landing on this uninhabited, uncharted island, right? So everyone gets off the boat and what do they do, right? It's not clear if they're going to be able to communicate with anyone else or how long they're going to be isolated, right? This is the scenario. So they look around on the island and they notice, oh, okay, there is some fresh water. And there's even like some coconut trees and looks like some other edible plants. Some fruit trees growing. What is the sane plan or what is the sane action, that would probably be agreed on, by most people in the world if they ended up in this situation? Well, I think it's safe to say for most people, they would say, okay, well, let's see, how much fresh water there is and food, and let's share it amongst ourselves, right? And why is that? Because they need it to survive, right? It's not, let's, find all of the fancy stones and spread, share them amongst ourselves. No, it's, what do we need to survive, right? That's a special kind of property, you could say, special kind of resource that has a ethical dimension to it, because if you keep it from someone who needs it to survive, you're then being abusive towards that person, right? So that's violating the non-aggression principle. It's an unliving thing to do. So again, I think most people would agree, yeah, let's share all of this pre-existing natural resource that is needed for survival. And not only that, but let's share the space itself, right? It wouldn't be right for one or two people to say, well, we claim 90% of this island, and the rest of you guys got to all cram in the corner over there, right? That wouldn't be the thought of most people, right? Why? Because that's unfair, right? We need space to have autonomy, to have freedom, to have privacy, right? To be able to relax. It wouldn't be right for some one or two people to do that, to claim they own the majority of the island and everyone else has to, be living on top of each other. Common sense, I think, right? And when I share this illustration with most people, it seems most people agree. They say, yeah, that's what I would do. That's the program I'd be down with if I ended up in that scenario. And I think everyone I know would probably be thinking the same. Yeah, of course, let's, share the food and water that's here and share the space. That's just a no-brainer, right? Okay, well, that's great. I'm glad that humans, are fundamentally good, and this is an illustration of that, right? That they're not all immediately looking to, murder or enslave each other, right? It's like, let's just chill out and share what's here and make the best of this, right? Maybe we can even have a good time. So, what does this have to do with sovereign homesteads? Well, everything, really, because advocating the solution of voluntary communities of sovereign homesteads is just advocating the same exact thought process and, you could say, social justice solution that would be carried out on the uninhabited island that the folks landed on. It's the same thing. But, right, people say, well, obviously, it's not exactly the same because the land isn't uninhabited, right? When you're born on the earth, right, it's already inhabited. And more specifically, it's already owned, right? So this is the objection. And this is where the weak morality, which is actually false morality, comes in, right? So there's this idea that, well, somebody already paid for it, however they got the money and whatever. They had a lot of money and they were able to buy, 1,000 acres or whatever. And now they rent property on that 1,000 acres. And you were born without a ton of money, and so you got to pay rent to one of these people that own land, that you don't own. Or even if you do own if you are able to own a piece of land, you still actually are just paying rent because you got to pay property taxes, right? So you don't actually ever own land in the way things are set up. But that's all justified, supposedly, right? And this definitely deserves a closer look. People just so quick to say, well, this is obviously just. This is obviously fair and square. Because if you pay for something, well, then you own it and that's it. Normally, yes. But is that always the case? Can you buy anything? Anything at all? Is everything up for sale? You might what might pop in your mind right now as well. Slavery isn't okay, right? But they did oftentimes, right? Buy, they paid money for the men and women, right? So is that okay? Because they paid, you know. And this is actually what they often would say in objection to those trying to free slaves. Or they would say, "Well, no, I paid good money. I paid, fair and square. I got the deed or whatever. I got the paperwork. I got the receipt. I paid for him. I paid for her. So you can't just take him or her, or I can't just let them go." So in that scenario, I think most people would agree, well, actually, the morally correct thing to do is let them go, even though the person paid for them, right? And why is that? It's because it wasn't a valid purchase in the first place. And why is that? Because owning your own body, you could say, is a birthright, right? Here in the States, right? You may be familiar with the Declaration of Independence. Maybe familiar with the idea of inalienable rights, right? Meaning rights that you're born with and that can never be taken away, or that they're rights that are permanent in all scenarios, right? And life and liberty being, the two most prominent, right? Your right to life and your right to liberty are inalienable rights. In other words, they're birthrights, right? And so if you're trying to purchase someone else's body, purchase their life, that's not valid because they have an inalienable right to their life and liberty, right? So even though it would be true that if you purchased, say, a truck, then yes, you have a right to control that truck. It doesn't hold true that if you somehow purchase a person who's been enslaved, that you have a right to then own and control that person. Again, because it's unethical, because it's violating their inalienable right to life and liberty. So, if you're following me there, and I think most people would, where most people have not made the connection is that if you have to pay other humans just to live on the planet, that's actually a violation of your inalienable rights, right? Because you need, on a survival level, right, food, shelter, right? And this comes from the land. Fundamentally, it comes from the land. Naturally, it comes from the land. And so if you're telling someone, you don't get to have access to that without paying me, that is usurping control of something that they should have had control of themselves. Again, going back to the uninhabited island, right? If one or two people were to say, you don't get a fair share of this, even though you need it for survival and for freedom and privacy and autonomy, for life and liberty, right? If someone were to do that on that uninhabited island scenario, it would be recognized as wrong, as ethically wrong, as unjust. That would not be social justice, right? Well, it really is the same, even though when we're born, it's, in on a it's on a place on the planet that is currently inhabited and where all the land is owned by someone, right? It is actually the same on an ethical level, because land and water are pre-existing in nature and they're necessary for life and liberty. And life and liberty are inalienable rights. So to say, oh, well, it's someone already bought it, is not a valid objection, just like the slave owner, slave master saying, oh, but I bought him or I bought her, is not a valid objection. It's invalid for the same exact ethical reason. And if you don't see that as true, you just need to think about it more carefully. Every objection, I've heard is coming either from that standpoint, where they think it's actually an unethical idea for people to have a birthright to a small portion of land and water. They think the idea is unethical because it would, they think, steal from other people. But the truth is, it's only reclaiming what has already been stolen from you. Because if you're born into an area where they're telling you, you don't have a right to have any little space for yourself, that's theft of your birthright. That's an abusive situation that you were born into. And you saying, hey, I want to end the abuse, doesn't make you abusive for saying so. Right? So the good and evil has been flipped. And that's been the number one problem for humanity ever since the very beginning, as illustrated in the story of Adam and Eve and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which the devil corrupted. And the way he corrupts the knowledge of good and evil is by flipping good for evil and evil for good. So people think the solution is a bad thing, right? We're indoctrinated in this society to believe that widespread abuse is actually good. For example, the accepted theft of everyone's birthright and extortion on top of that, the taxation on top of that. And then I would add also, carnism towards animals, enslavement and mass murder of animals is considered A-OK, even though we were designed as herbivores and animals are sentient, have feelings, feel pain and want to live. So actually it's just clearly unethical to enslave and murder them for no good reason, because we can get all our nutrition, including vitamin B12, elsewhere. We've been bamboozled, deceived. Humanity has been into thinking abuse is actually a good thing, and those advocating the end of abuse, they're actually made out to be the bad guys, right? Sovereign veganic homesteads, the sovereign meaning that you're not being ruled over, so no ruler, anarchy, right? That's made out to be a horrible thing, dangerous, even just violent in and of itself somehow, even though it's just a position against violence. And people have a very strong reaction, usually to veganism too, where they will call the vegan an extremist and part of some terrible agenda. Again, they make the good out to be bad, and the bad, which is unnecessary abuse, out to be good somehow. So I hope this made it more clear why sovereign, vegan, organic homesteads are simply expressing the non-aggression principle on a social level, just as would occur on that uninhabited island. And if there was enough plant foods to eat, it wouldn't be justifiable to kill any animals either, right? Why? Again, because they're sentient, they have emotions, they feel pain, fish included, and they want to live. So you should just leave them alone, just not be violent. It's not complicated. It's just being non-abusive. But again, we've been deceived into thinking abuse is actually justice, which is especially obvious with Marxism, communism, and thinking that what would actually be true justice, what would actually be just the right thing to do for everybody, including animals, that common sense that would be more common if we weren't born into this society that's already been so misled, and the abuse has been so cemented and normalized. You can kind of snap yourself out of it by imagining not living in it for a moment. And what would you do in just that small scale scenario? And you can discover the ethics that holds true universally, as I've attempted to explain here. All right, thanks for listening.